Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us. As always, I cannot wait to introduce our guest to you. You are watching Truer MU, and Truer MU is a channel where we talk about how we practice. And a lot of that is music. So if you're a musician, you'll find it very interesting. But we also have writers and creatives and producers on our show. So check us out at truermu.com, and you can go on YouTube and enter TruerMU. Please like and subscribe if you like what you see. As you may have seen on the first show of this kind where we talk to writers, I am part of a wonderful group based in Houston called The Final Twist. And it's a wonderful writers group. I can't believe I lucked out to be with these people. And we have released an anthology. I only got in on this late. They've released a number of these anthologies, and I'm only in the last couple. And I wanted to talk to some of my fellow writers about that anthology and about being in it. So let me introduce my guest to you today. Cash Anthony is a multi-degreed recovering lawyer, a former librarian, a producer and director for stage and film, an award-winning short story author, an editor, and a writer of option screenplays as a master screenwriter certified by Screenwriting University. She's also the treasurer of the Final Twist Writer Society, or I believe you're still the treasurer. Is that correct, Cash?
Just got promoted to vice president.
Woohoo! Okay. Welcome to our show.
Thank you.
I want to start by having you read to us from your story that will be in this newest anthology. What's the name of the anthology?
The anthology is called We Were Warned, and the focus is superstitions and taboos.
Okay. Do you want to introduce this passage or do you just want to dive in?
I'll give you a little bit of a background on it. This is an excerpt from my story, Invisible Evidence. I have a franchise character, a steadfast character named Jessie Carr. Jessie Carr is a private investigator, and she and her partner, Bo Marsberg, who's a retired Texas Ranger, have had to stop at Wild Comb Manor, an old Texas mansion converted into a B&B because of a winter storm. The owner, one Martin Comer, has been found dead upstairs, murdered. Other guests present are Judge Adkhari, who has asked Jessie and Bo to investigate, Gaynell Johnston, a fashion model, Moira, the devoted Irish housekeeper, and Roddy Eckelman, better known as the Poison Wizard. Moments ago, in a conversation with Brian, the kitchen lad, who's just been revealed to be the dead man's son, Brian has provided many clues. The Poison Wizard awoke with a start. He glared at Jessie, but Judge Adkhari was shooting daggers at Gaynell. She slouched for the door, ignoring him. Talking to the kitchen lad was instructive, Jessie said. Instructive how? Eckelman asked. We learned we should pursue the issue of possible motives. I only met Martin once in his office last night. Eckelman wiped his brow. He was sweating heavily. But your reason for being here was related to poison, wasn't it? Jessie pinned Eckelman with a stare. Eckelman fidgeted nervously. Tell us what you learned in Mexico, Bo demanded. He didn't notice Moira entering, still wiping tears from her cheeks. Jessie did. I was visiting a village of the Raza Chitl tribe in the Sierra Madres, said Eckelman. Several of their traditions involve hallucinogens. They use a species of toad, the Bufo alvarius. And what's that when it's at home? Moira asked. Its common name is the Colorado River toad. Eckelman wiped his brow again. They use them how? Jessie asked, already knowing the answer. The shaman licks it. Licks it? Judge Adkhari repeated. Dear Lum, Moira cried. Eckelman straightened in his chair. That species is known for its potent skin secretions. They contain 5-MeO-DMT, a psychoactive compound. The shaman absorbs that through his tongue, then falls into an altered state of consciousness. When he comes to, he describes it. He'll say he merged into the universe. He saw fantastic colors. He finally understood reality. and he had encounters with spiritual beings sending messages back to the tribe. So Martin did this. Intrigued by Eckelmann's account, Jesse and Bo failed to notice Gaynell slipping silently into the foyer. Startled, they looked up when she shouted, "Let me go!" Brian had grabbed her arm and pushed her back into the living room. "You're not leaving till I know what happened to my dad," he yelled.
Thank you very much. Looking forward to reading the rest of that. I want to talk about you and your life. Your life is fascinating and could easily be a book. I hope you will write it someday. We'll just touch on some of the highlights in this interview. I want to start with you as a child. You traveled a lot as a child and had exposure to lots of cultures and languages. How did that impact your view of yourself and your world?
Interesting question. Well, of the world, I found that the world was full of fascinating people and wonderful historical places. I lived in Germany when I was very young, and my father was something of a polyglot. He spoke several languages, and whenever he would take me somewhere, he always knew someone, and often they had children, so I would go and play with them, and I would pick up the languages that they were speaking. German kind of became my second language, but I spoke fairly fluent Italian by the time I was 4 or 5. My father spoke French, he spoke Italian, he spoke a little Russian, he spoke some language that was out of, I believe, the Solomon Islands, and I know he could read it because I have a book of his in that. So it was that the world was just a place full of wonderful things.
So, your child's wonder maybe lasted longer than a lot of children's wonder does today.
Well, to a certain extent, it still does.
Yeah. So, in other words, you still have a sense of wonder about the world.
I do, and it's partly been enhanced by the fact that I love to research. So whenever I write something, I almost always have some story that I've read in the newspaper or some idea that I've seen something about on television, and I want to go and find out more about it. And it oftentimes is something that makes me really mad. And because Jessie is an avenging angel, as well as a PI, she tries to get even with people in ways that the law can't always help with.
Yeah. You married young, your first marriage. You were married a number of times. And in the first marriage, I believe you were you followed your husband to be stationed in Germany, and you got a job as a librarian. Is that correct?
I was the only person on a very primitive air base that had any experience with the Air Force library system. So when the official librarian left, she was transferred about 40 miles away, and she had no way really to supervise anyone who was there. So since she learned that I had some experience working in London in the library there, she asked if I would like to be the acting librarian, and I took that over.
And did you learn anything in that position?
Oh, I learned a lot. That was a year when the United States was closing bases all over the world. And so our base was the only base that was opened in the whole world that year.
Wow.
We had no books at the library. I mean, we maybe had 20 books when I took over. So my friend, whose name was Eileen, the supervisor, she taught me how I could requisition books from those bases that were closing. And pretty soon I had boxes and truckloads of books coming to our library. And I taught myself to catalog, and I hired someone to help, and we cataloged about 7,000 books before we were done.
For somebody that loves to research, I think there may be something in that. Yeah. So from there, you ended up becoming the assistant editor for the base newspaper. How did that transition occur?
Well, they hired a permanent librarian, and I didn't really get along with her, and I don't know that there really was a position for me when she arrived. So I had gotten to know the people on the staff of the base newspaper, and they needed help, and I kind of wormed my way into it.
Uh-huh. Why did you do that? Did you want to be on the newspaper?
I wanted to be doing something, and it seemed to accord with my background. Um, they were short staffed. They didn't have to pay me. I mean, eventually I think they did. I don't even really remember, but I know for a while I was just a volunteer, and I learned a great deal. They taught me copy editing. They taught me how to write for an audience. They taught me photography. Um, I got to interview people. I got to go to our base hockey games, and I became a sports photographer. Um, and I also learned about the construction of the newspaper, because in those days they were still using linotype. So we would put the newspaper together and then take it 40 miles to another town and spend the day putting the newspaper together. So I learned to read backwards and upside down. And then we would take the proofs as they came off, and we would take them and sit and proof them and make the corrections and give them back to the people who were putting the newspaper together. And finally, usually it would take most of the day. We would leave and take the train back to the base, and the next day the newspapers would be delivered.
So, lots of valuable skills for a writer in that newspaper business that you maybe didn't have before. Had you been writing prior to the newspaper? Did this just enhance your skills, or did this really get you started as a writer?
I had been urged by my father to write. He wrote some stories. He was fascinated because I was writing poetry when I was fairly young. Wasn't very good poetry, but he encouraged that. And I didn't find out until I announced to my mother that I was going to law school that he'd always wanted me to go to law school and become an attorney. He'd never told me that.
Huh. Yeah, we'll be getting to that in a bit. But so did neither of them wanted you to be a writer, or did you want to be a writer when you were young? Was that a dream?
I'm not sure it was as formed as a dream. I think it
Mhm.
was really just an interest and something that I indulged
Yeah.
sometimes.
And so you're finding your way closer to it by working at a library and then in a newspaper, getting closer. Like the bombs are falling closer and closer, right? But there's another thread to your life also, and that is theater and music. They were always a part of your life, kind of a parallel thing coming along. Will you talk about what they offered you?
My parents sent me to dance lessons when I was about 5, and I loved that. Um, I think I probably didn't begin being as interested in music. I mean, they did give me piano lessons when I was also about that same age. Um, the dance really came back later, but the music lessons, I think, became ingrained in my mind as just something to enjoy, not necessarily to perform, but just to enjoy music. And then eventually I learned to play instruments. I stayed on with piano for 12 or 13 years, I think. Um, in high school, I played trumpet. I had a friend who taught me guitar. I played organ for the church. Not very good, but I did play.
If you can play organ at a church, you're in a very small club. That's a professional capacity musician, whether you're good or not.
Mm. Well, they put up with it.
Yeah, well, I mean, it takes a lot of guts to do that. So there's a certain amount of bravery, maybe a willingness to put yourself out there in that.
And I took up theater, I think also maybe in junior high, but yes, in junior high, I think I began being interested in theater, and then I stayed interested in theater all through high school.
Mhm.
I left that when I went to college, and it wasn't until when I was in Germany, we were at this very small base. We didn't have much entertainment, but there was an army base that was quite large across town, and they had a community theater there. So I got interested in that again.
Mhm. So, what is the difference for you between putting yourself out there in front of people to be evaluated for how well you entertain them as a performer versus a writer?
Well, I don't have to see their expressions.
When you write?
Uh, I can hope that they're going to be entertained. I hope that they find the stories compelling and continue to read all the way through and get something out of them. The, uh, the stories that I write now are essentially based on the kinds of things that I like to read. I like to read thrillers, and I'm not yet skilled enough to write thrillers, but I do write murder mysteries, and those I find a lot of fun.
Yeah. Well, let's continue with your life. You returned to the States and you prepared for medical school, but you were diverted. Will you talk about that diversion?
Well, I had taken one tangent when I was in my early undergraduate life. And then when I came back, I had worked in a hospital while I was in London. And I worked for a wonderful doctor, Dr. Sanford. Um, Sanford Markham was his last name. And I worked in the OBGYN area of the hospital. And they always needed people to come in as chaperones when the doctors would be examining the patients. And he was a wonderful doctor because he not only explained to the patient what was happening, he was very good at explaining to me what he was doing. And the farther I went with that, the more I thought, well, this could be something that I might really want to study. So when I came back to the US, I was very happy to get back into the undergraduate program that I had originally been in. At, at UT, it's called Plan 2, which is a honors liberal arts program. And it was great because you could take classes from any part of anything on campus. It didn't matter what school you were in. It didn't matter what, you didn't have to have a major. Um, so when I came back, I began to study the pre-med classes, which was biology, biological sciences, and physical sciences. And I got through the MedCap, the admission exam. And about the time I was interviewing at the medical schools, most of them here in Houston, I learned that I was quite ill. And it was sufficiently serious that I thought, I'm not sure that I'm going to live long enough to go through the whole curriculum to become a doctor. So by then I had 6 concentrations. We didn't have majors, but we had concentrations. I had 6. I had one in French, which had been my original interest, and then in secondary education, because you had to have that to be a teacher. And then when I was in Germany, I had picked up another concentration in German and in European history. Then I came back and had biological and physical sciences, so I had 6. But I really didn't have a career path. Um, and at that point, I just wanted to graduate. I just wanted to quit going to school for a while and get out in the world and do something else. So, so that's what I did. And I was out of school for maybe a couple of years. And then I met my husband, now my husband, and I knew that he was a musician. He was a pianist. Um, he had come from your alma mater. He had studied at Oberlin,
Yep.
and he had been admitted to Juilliard, but his father had become very ill, so he came back to Texas. And after his father passed away, he taught music for a while, and he was in a master's program at UT. And then he had an injury to his wrist, and he decided that the surgery that might have been recommended for it was not going to allow him to continue to play. So he had an uncle that he was very fond of, who was an attorney, and decided to go to law school. So kind of not really knowing what else to do with my life, I took the law school admission exam and I passed it. And I was in no position to go to law school. I was just establishing myself as a single person again. I had no money. I had a job that I had just taken. And a friend of mine was very kind. When Tim began to report how wonderful law school was and what interesting lectures he was attending, I just felt terrible. I had let this whole thing go by. I hadn't even responded. So my friend said to me, you know, this is really silly. You've been admitted. That's the hard part. You need to go, even if you have to live in a garret with peeling wallpaper. You can do that for a couple of years. You can survive that. Go ahead, finish your education, get through law school, um, go find out what you can do about it. So I went down to the law school and I talked to the dean of students. I didn't know at the time that he was the father of an old friend of mine from high school. Just didn't I didn't quite put it together. And he was so nice. He said, "Well, tell me about yourself and your grades and your scores." Um, and I did. And he said, "Okay, come with me." And I said, "What are we doing?" He said, "Come with me." So he took me down to the student aid office and they wrote me a check. And he said, "Start tomorrow." So I did. I went out and paid my tuition and got my books, and I started the next day. And I had about 3 days worth of classes to catch up on. But I did that and went on through and graduated from law school.
Yeah. And so you were a lawyer, and you had a very interesting career as a lawyer, including a huge life changing case. Why don't you talk about your legal career before the big case and then talk about the big case? Because it's quite a story.
Well, I began at the district attorney's office here in Harris County. And Harris County is one of the largest counties by population in the country. So we were very, very busy and we had trials constantly. I mean, I think I was set for trial every day. We would go into the courtroom and work out the morning docket of cases that would settle or be reset. And then we would try cases all afternoon. And I also went out to the JP courts. And that was something that the baby lawyers got to do, was travel around the city. I really learned the city. Um, there was one day when I got to JP court and there was only one prosecutor assigned per court. So the judge waited for me to get there because I had to find my way out to the suburbs. And it was a busy docket that day. We ended up trying 8 bench trials and 2 jury trials that day. Now they're all simple cases because they're not big, elaborate, weeks-long felony cases, but that kind of experience teaches you to try a case. I left the DA's office and I went to a litigation firm downtown, and there was a split among the partners. So the partner that had hired me to come and work for him was one of the ones that was ousted. I think he was willing to go, but it was very uncertain as to who I was working for. Was I still supposed to work for him? Was I working for the firm? Nobody was very clear with me about how I was going to manage that. And then I had an opportunity to leave and go to a medical malpractice and dental malpractice firm. So I did that. And there was a split in that firm as well. And that's when I went out on my own. So I opened my own private practice. I was in private practice about 13 years as a solo. During that case, one of the people that I had come to know as a prosecutor came in one day and brought a young man with him who was a deputy sheriff, and said that he was in big trouble because he had been accused, in fact, charged with credit fixing, essentially fraud, that he had falsified his information in order to buy a car. Well, he had tried to buy a car, but there was no reason for him to falsify his information. He qualified for the loan for the car. But it turned out that there was a ring of credit fixers that was operating out of that dealership. And I brought a racketeering case. I mean, it fit the statute perfectly. So there were maybe 10 or 12 defendants, including several businesses. Before that case was over, my office was broken into, my files were riffled through. His fiance was attacked in her apartment and had to hold the door with one hand and the shotgun in the other for fear that they would come in. I kept a pistol in my desk drawer because I was very frightened of what was going to happen. When I would leave the house in the morning to go to my office, I turned back every day and looked at the door because I wasn't sure if the house would be there when I came back.
Yeah.
And Tim had a very demanding and um, fraught kind of career as well. He had been clerking for a federal judge and he was working on both civil and criminal cases. So there were bad people out there that might have been after either one of us.
Mm-hmm.
We did try the case. We obtained a nice judgment for it. And one of the men who owned one of the businesses I was suing was murdered. So it was a dicey kind of time.
Was that what got you out of law? Because you didn't stay as a lawyer. Was that the thing that took you out, or was it something else?